number one concern for retirees we talk about all the time. It's, in the polls and AARP, all that good stuff. So the biggest concern that most Americans have are, am I going to have enough income to get me through retirement? That's the key word, through. A lot of us will sit down and do some rudimentary planning and things look really good on paper when we first start retirement. But what we do is we take it much, much further than that. Is, we are going to basically do the long range planning and forecasting for you with the Take Point on Retirement Freedom Plan. It's called our SMART plan. You've got to really evaluate, how do things look in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? That's the biggest challenge we have, is to get people to really think long term and do some forecasting, and also to consider all of the risks that may face us. Like, number one, longevity, right? How long are you going to live? People are living longer. And we've talked about this a few times before, but with technology, healthcare, things that are the advancements that are coming, perhaps we're going to live even longer. So that longevity, how long am I going to be here after I retire? Some of us don't have a choice, right? When we get to say, hey, I want to leave my job. Sometimes we're forced into retirement. Sometimes, things just happen and we have to retire a little earlier. There's, health issues, things like that may require you to retire early. So that's why, we always stress sooner than later. If you're 5 years out, let's not wait until the day you retire to figure this out. Let's start planning and looking at all the potential risks, long-term care, healthcare. These are the things that people don't factor into their little rudimentary calculators when they just figure, oh, okay, I'm going to put a few things down on paper. When I retire, I'll have Social Security at this amount. And then, I have a pension at this amount. My wife has this Social Security. Our bills are kind of running about this, so we're fine. Well, no, did you factor in inflation? Did you factor in that 5 years from now, the cost of living is going to be much, much higher? No, you probably didn't. Did you factor in what happens that, healthcare concerns, rising costs in healthcare is our biggest concern. We talk about inflation on this show, Social Security, COLA, and we talk about how important inflation is, but do we really know the insane amount of inflation and the rising costs in healthcare? Those numbers are astronomical and exponential. So our Medicare premiums, our healthcare premiums are continuing to rise and go higher. And so these are the real concerns and the real big expenses that we're facing. Even with healthcare, Medicare, couples are looking at $300,000 to $400,000 in medical care costs in their retirement, throughout their lifetime retirement. So when we do our planning, we're doing it 30 years out. So whether you retire at 60, 65, 70, whatever that number is going to be for you, let's look at, how are things going to look 30 years from now? Let's consider our spouses. Maybe our spouse is younger than us, and we've got to look at what income is going to look like when she's just the only one or he's just the only one alive, right? So all of these different concerns that just don't come into account into some basic scratch paper analysis. And so that's why we've got to, we've been doing this for a long time. We know all the risks that are facing you. And so, things that keep us up at night may not keep you up at night because you don't even see them coming, but we take into account, factor all these things. And then, so, rising healthcare costs, inflation, knowing what your Social Security is going to be, all those things are key data. But like what you alluded to, first and foremost, is what are we spending? Like, what does retirement look like to you? What are we doing in retirement? And often I have that conversation with people and across the table here in my office. And when I ask them that question, they just kind of stare off into space like they don't know the answer. They haven't really thought about that. And they just think life is going to kind of be the same, as it is currently. But life's going to be very different when you do retire. And so maybe you're spending more in the beginning ages, like we call like your early years of retirement in your 60s is kind of like your go-go. Like, hey, you got your bucket list stuff. You're still pretty young. You're pretty healthy. You know, you're coming out the gate all excited. And maybe you're going to spend more money in those first 5 or 10 years. And then maybe you get in your 70s. It's kind of like, we call it kind of like the slow go period. Like we start slowing down a little bit. Maybe we're not traveling as much. Maybe we're just kind of hanging out around home. You know, maybe our costs go down. Maybe we're eating a little less, going out to eat a lot less. Who knows? And then you get into your 80s, it's called kind of the no-go phase. Like, we're kind of maybe sitting on the rocking chair or, hopefully not in like an assisted living facility or something like that. But, spending a lot less then. So let's factor all that in, but let's look at your budget. We talk about it all the time on the show. And everybody, I had a lady in the office yesterday, career woman, very intelligent woman, and, asked a simple question: what's your budget? Blank stare. No, nobody does budgets anymore. They have no idea what they're spending. And it's easy. Like, okay, I'm making money, I'm working, and, money's coming in the bank account and money's going out. And I see that I have a little bit more left. And, oh, I'm fine. Right. So no, that's not a budget. Like, we need to really sit down and look at, what is our budget? And even if you're not retired yet, you need a budget now. It's just a good kind of exercise to go through and some discipline to start preparing for retirement and maybe be able to save a little bit more for retirement. So, looking at ways that you can save and tighten the belt and start budgeting now is super important, because we can do all the forecasting in the world, but if we don't have your expenses right, then it's all for nothing, right? So we need to know what you're spending in retirement. And then we factor in inflation into that, right? So we can see that those expenses are going up. Maybe we got to put a long-term care policy in place. There's some really great products out there that are going to provide for a long-term healthcare need that you may have in your 70s or 80s that you never thought about in your rudimentary kind of calculation. So we need to look at that long-term care, life insurance, and then we get into taxes. Like, how do we do our best to minimize the blow of taxes, to minimize the blow of fees and expenses? So those can be the real silent killers also of your retirement calculations. And so all of these factors go into our planning process to where we can really forecast and show you and portray like, hey, looks like you're going to be fine. And, or it looks like, hey, you know what, maybe we need to work a little longer, or, hey, maybe we need to spend a little less, or, and so these are things that you just can't stab at in the dark. We've got to get really clear, concise calculations in place and forecasting. High interest rates, low interest rates, stock market, good returns, bad returns, interest rates, all that kind of stuff.